In the spring of 1864, as 3 years of relentless warfare press on, the Texas Brigade finds itself back in Virginia after enduring a harsh winter in eastern Tennessee. Struggling with shortages of rations, uniforms, and blankets, morale within the brigade has plummeted to unprecedented lows, leading to a surge in desertions. The brigade is now under the leadership of John Gregg, following the removal of Jerome Robertson, affectionately known as Aunt Polly by the brigade, who survived a court-martial but was ultimately relieved of command and dispatched back to Texas. In the North, Ulysses S. Grant has been promoted to lieutenant general and given command of all Union forces. He's now planning a spring campaign to capture Richmond and end the war, the Overland Campaign.
Lee in May 1864 understands that the burden of the Confederate war effort has now fallen to him. There's no reinforcements coming from beyond the Mississippi River because the Confederacy's been cut in half. There would be no reinforcements coming from the near west, Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, because that army has also been depleted. It's up to him and his army in Northern Virginia to see what they can do about winning this war. But as Lee explains to a staff officer, he's got an interesting problem in that he always understood his enemy. McClellan and he had worked at West Point. He was familiar with George Gordon Meade. But he tells his staff officer, this fellow Grant, I don't know. I don't understand him, and I'm not certain what to do with him.
By April the 26th, the Texans are in camp around Mechanicsville. Rations and new uniforms have been issued, and the morale is markedly improved. The ranks have been replenished when 320 soldiers on furlough or injured during the Battle of Chickamauga return. The winter in Tennessee is long forgotten, and the men were ready for the next fight.
On the other side, Grant is very certain what he's going to do. He has a 2, maybe 3-to-1 advantage in manpower between his army and that of Robert E. Lee's. He can draw upon an infinite variety of reinforcements and resources. And so, as he told his subordinates, as General-in-Chief, he would direct their efforts to, as he said, them that ain't skinning can hold a leg. Benjamin Butler would march up the James River towards Richmond. Bill Sheridan would march through the valley, laying waste to the Confederacy's breadbasket. William T. Sherman would keep the Confederate Army of the Tennessee in a death grip, drive it back on Atlanta, hopefully take Atlanta, and then see what devastation he could wreak upon Confederate resources in the East. Grant himself would travel with George G. Meade. Meade retained command of the Army of the Potomac, but his boss traveled with him. And Grant would see to it that the pressure was applied not only on all fronts, but specifically on Lee's army as the army that carried the standard of the Confederate war cause.
On May the 1st, the brigade moved a few miles north of Gordonsville, and on May the 4th, they were ordered to cook 3 days' rations, a sure sign that they were about to be on the move. Late in the afternoon, they left and marched 16 miles, arriving at Brock's Bridge over the North Anna River, where they rested for the night. As the campaign is about to begin, Grant has a clear advantage with 116,000 men and 40 infantry and 7 cavalry brigades, supported by 358 guns of artillery, against Lee's 65,000 men and 35 understaffed infantry and 7 understaffed cavalry brigades, supported by 224 guns.
As the campaign season begins in May 1864, Grant, as several others had done before him, crosses into Virginia, headed south, with a large Union host, and Lee, as he had done several times before, marched to meet him. Now, to level out the odds, Lee made sure to hit Grant in the tangled woodlands of what we call the wilderness, near Chancellorsville, Fredericksburg, the site of previous Lee victories. Lee hit him hard, drove back the Union forces, and then was astounded that, unlike previous Union commanders, Grant did not back up. Lee anticipated that his enemy would retire. So he told his forces out along the edges of the wilderness not to bother entrenching that night. In the morning, they would take care of business. And I truly think Lee expected that they would find the Union camps abandoned and Grant backing up. Instead, Grant hit Lee hard at dawn, and Lee's unprepared, depleted forces were driven back by much larger Union contingents. Lee rides forward, frantically looking for anybody he can put in to stop the flow of Union forces coming forward. Up rides an officer he did not know. And he was told by this officer that he had forces, troops with him that would stop this Union onslaught. And Lee, quite naturally, asked him, "Who are you?" And he said, "Well, I'm John Gregg. I command the Texans." And Lee allegedly smiled at him and said, "The Texans always drive them." So the Texans got in battle formation, as they had done so many times before, and began to move forward. They realized that Lee was in front of them. Now, this is not where the commanding general ought to be. Commanding general ought to be in the back, safe from enemy bullets. This is very odd. But Lee, I think, unlike some authors who say Lee had a death wish, Lee did not want to outlive the Confederacy. There's a lot of romantic notions. No, when you're outnumbered, for any good commander, there's one more factor you can throw into the fight, and that's yourself, your leadership. You can inspire the men. That's why about 20% of Confederate generals died in combat. Unlike their Union counterparts, they found themselves in this situation. So Lee rode forward out in front of the Texans, who refused to charge unless Lee went to the rear. Lee to the rear became the cry. They did not want to see their commander killed. They didn't want to see the end of Marsh Robert. Lee stopped, which allowed a crowd of the Texans to get around him, each snatching for Traveler's bridle. For years after the war, there will debate who actually grabbed Traveler's bridle and led Lee to the rear. The guy who won that strange historical lottery was Leonard Gee. Henry McCardle was going to paint Lee to the rear for the Texas Capitol. And after talking with many of the veterans who still survived, this would be 15 years after the war, Leonard Gee won the brass ring. He was named as probably the guy who really did grab Traveler's bridle and take Lee to the rear. So Lee was led to the rear, and when he was safe, the Texans closed ranks, maybe 800 of them at the most, and charged straight in the heart of several Union units, totaling well over 6,000 soldiers, and, as Lee expected, drove them back. But only about half of the Texans returned from that charge. But Lee was safe. The army had been saved, and once again the Texans had been Lee's shock troops that took the laurels and won the day.
In a battle that lasted a little over 25 minutes, out of the roughly 800 men in the Texas Brigade who went into battle, 440 were either killed, wounded, or captured. Some estimates have that number as high as 550. John Gregg, who commanded the Texas Brigade, had 3 horses shot out from under him and was wounded, as was Henry Benning, whose Georgia Brigade relieved the Texans. And Corps Commander James Longstreet was severely wounded by friendly fire. John Smuts writes in his book, The Bloody Fifth, that on May the 7th, both sides remained behind their breastworks, too exhausted and depleted to renew the battle. Groups ventured into no man's land to recover the dead and dying. The 5th Texas had been hit especially hard. Lieutenant Colonel King Bryan, who commanded the 5th, had been killed, and acting commander Captain Tacitus Clay had been wounded. The Texans gathered their dead and buried them in a mass grave in the shade of a stately oak tree along the Orange Plank Road. The Texas Brigade might have saved Lee's army, but it would never again be the same.